So then, US President Joe Biden is threatening to stop the supply of weapons to Israel if it launches a large-scale attack on Rafah. Washington has been pressuring Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for weeks not to send forces into the city in the south of Gaza, where more than 1.5 million displaced Palestinians have been sheltering. In his strongest comments to date, Biden confirmed the US has already paused a shipment of weapons to Israel, consisting of thousands of large bombs, and he admitted that American supplied weapons that are killing Palestinians.
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. And I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah.
But some Israeli forces are on the ground in Rafah, and they've been targeting residential areas. And on Wednesday, Israeli tanks forced the Rafah border crossing to Egypt to close. It's the main entry point for aid trucks to get into Gaza. John Hendren begins our coverage from Chicago.
The president has said he is not going to ship munitions, offensive munitions, into Israel. He says he will continue to supply the defensive weapons, such as the Iron Dome interceptors. But because he's been specifically urging Israel not to go into Rafah at a time when 1 million people are sheltering there, and the U.S. has expressed a concern about their safety, he said he does not want to send those offensive weapons, the big bombs, in there. And Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, told members of Congress that that amounts to one shipment of munitions. Now, they haven't decided if that shipment will go forward in the future. But because an invasion of Rafah in a larger sense seems to be about to go forward, the Biden administration is saying it is going to draw the line. And that's really the first time that we know of publicly that Biden has said no to Israel during this conflict. He's long said that Israel has been too aggressive in this battle, that too many civilians have died. This is the first time we know of that he simply said, no, you may not have these.
Well, Doug Bando is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He's also a former special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. Joins us now from Washington, D.C. Doug, welcome to Al Jazeera. Good to have you here with us. To what extent do you think Biden's hand has been forced here? Is he speaking simply to appease potential voters?
I think he is dealing with very serious political problems. He has a lot of progressive, young progressives, as well as Arab Americans who've been very angry about his stand in Gaza and his support for Israel. He's worried about losing those votes in November. And the campus protests have intensified that. He hoped that this crisis would go away, but these protests have actually amplified it, made it more threatening to him. So I believe this is an effort to show that he's heard them, and that he is willing to put pressure on Israel for the first time in a way that we have never seen before.
You mentioned his support for Israel, and given that steadfast support to date, do you think that this decision will have come hard for him personally?
I think this is very difficult for him. He has long said he's the most pro-Israeli president ever. Earlier in the Gaza operation, he said that he would do nothing to interfere with Israel's right to defend itself. So this is a major step forward to withhold some of those munitions and bombs. The Israelis have to pay attention to that.
And what about the protesters now? Do you think this will go any way to appease them?
My guess is that one time is not enough. They will look at this and tell themselves, we need to protest more. That we finally got the president's attention. He finally responded, but they want a ceasefire. They want to end this conflict. So I think they're going to go on with their protests.
And what about the other side of this? What about for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel and the Rafah offensive? How do you think it's going to implicate that?
It's going to be a very real challenge. If they lose access to these munitions, it's going to be harder for them to prosecute the war. Netanyahu's political future really depends on keeping the war going. If there was an election tomorrow, he'd almost certainly lose. He's also going to be under extraordinary pressure from other coalition partners. They want the war to continue. They've threatened to abandon him if he doesn't. And, it's going to be hard. Almost any Israeli is going to feel some frustration at being told by the U.S. how it should run its campaign. So I suspect they may go ahead and try a game of geopolitical chicken with the U.S.
How long a pause in the supply of weapons would there have to be to make a difference to Israel's ability to attack? I mean, what's their arsenal like? How much stock do they have?
Well, they certainly have a lot, but this kind of campaign, they've expended an awful lot. What's important is if you launch a campaign is you want to know that your supplies are secure, because at the moment, it's conceivable the U.S. would restart, but then if the U.S. cuts off in the future, the Israelis could be in a vulnerable position. They might have started hostilities again, engaged in a lot of activity, and suddenly find themselves without necessary munitions. So it's hard to run a campaign if you're not certain that the resupply is coming.
In terms of talking of campaigns, in terms of Joe Biden's political campaign, also very difficult given the uncertainty of what could happen in Rafah and within the whole Gaza issue.
Exactly. He's going to be criticized by Israel supporters in the U.S. It's almost certain that Republicans on Capitol Hill, as well as Donald Trump, who is leading in a lot of polls, are going to use this against the president. They're going to play the pro-Israel card. So this is going to be a very difficult campaign for President Biden. This is an issue he really did hope would disappear. And what he's found is it won't. And he's in danger of antagonizing both sides now.
Doug Bando, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.